Okay, now it's recording. Okay, so Rabbi Sai, we are on the very top line on Daf Mem Gimel Amud Aleph, and yesterday we began a very illustrated parak called Elu Trefos, which is you really need a good knowledge of veterinary science in order to follow it. So there are some good guides that have illustrations to Maseches CHULLIN, the art scroll in Steinsaltz Gemaras, and there's actually a separate volume to help with color illustrations that many of us have. Yesterday we learned that there are, based on a Mosaic tradition, there are 18 different kinds of organ deficiencies that render an animal treifa. A little bit of a discrepancy as to what those are, disputed. But now we're up to another method of categorization, which is that of Ula. And Ula says, Ches mine treifos nemru lo Moshe b'Sinai. There are 8 types of deficiency. Now here we're not addressing the organ, but we're addressing the type of deficiency. And depending upon the organ, certain kinds of deficiencies or traumas to the organ will cause the animal to become a treifa. But these 8 are descriptive of either the trauma or the deficiency in the organ. So what are they? Nekuva, which means a puncture. Pisuka, which means severed. Netula, which means removed. Chasura, which means it was never there to begin with. Kirua, torn. Drusa, mauled. Nefula, fell down, which means that if there was a trauma for an animal that falls from a height onto the ground, that can create a treifa, and ushavura, and a broken limb. So all of these 8 are different categories. These are different actions that can occur, or trauma that can occur to an animal or an animal's organs that will render it a treifa. La'afuki lekusa derachish bar papa. So why is this categorization important? Because it conspicuously excludes diseased organs. Rachish Bar Papa yesterday had said that if a kidney is diseased, even if it's completely intact, so then it renders the animal treifa. Ula's categorization disagrees with that. As long as the kidney is intact, even if it's diseased, the animal is not a treifa. Amar Chia bar Rava, Ches treifos yesh b'nekuva. And Chia bar Rava now has a different categorization, specifically by punctures, because we know that puncture is one of the types of trauma or deficiency that can occur to certain organs. There are 8 organs, says Chia bar Rava, that become treifa if they merely sustain a puncture. We know that not all organs that are punctured render the animal treifa. There are 8 organs that if they're punctured, render the animal a treifa. Now, im tomar tes, mara Reb Yossi b'Reb Yehuda ketanila. So maybe you'll argue that based on your counting of the different organs in the Mishnah, you count 9. Well, that's because our Mishnah includes the gallbladder as one of the organs that becomes treifa through a puncture. And that only goes according to Reb Yossi b'Reb Yehuda, and not according to the other Chachamim. Tanya nikva hakeva nikvu hadakim treifa, and Reb Yossi b'Reb Yehuda omer af nikva hamara. And this brisa illustrates that. This brisa says that according to the Tanakama, if the stomach or the small intestine sustains a puncture, it renders the animal treifa. Reb Yossi b'Reb Yehuda adds and says that even if the gallbladder is punctured, it renders the animal treifa. So you see that that's only according to Rabbi Yossi b'Reb Yehuda. Our Mishnah is going according to him, but Chia bar Rava is not going according to Rabbi Yossi b'Reb Yehuda, and that's why he says 8 and not 9. Amar Reb Yitzchak b'Reb Yossi, b'Reb Yosef Amar Reb Yochanan. We're now going to see a series of statements that are made by a student of Reb Yochanan named Reb Yitzchak b'Reb Yosef in the name of his Rebbe Reb Yochanan. First he says, Halacha k'Reb Yossi b'Reb Yehuda. Number 1, we paskin like Reb Yosef b'Reb Yehuda that a puncture in a gallbladder renders the animal treifa. V'amar Reb Yitzchak bar Yosef Amar Reb Yochanan. Next statement. Mai ahadru lechavri leReb Yossi b'Reb Yehuda. Do you know what the argument, the basis of argument between Reb Yosef b'Reb Yehuda and the Chachamim was? Why did the Chachamim maintain that a punctured gallbladder is not a treifa? So listen to this interesting answer. They quoted a pasuk from Eo, from the book of Job, where Eov described about himself all of the trauma that he had sustained, all the suffering that he had gone through. And one of them was, Yishboch la'aretz mirei rasi, that God pours down to the earth my gallbladder. So what he's describing is, I've suffered a trauma to my gallbladder. God has caused it to fall. And yet, Eov is still alive to tell the tale. So that proves that a puncture to the gallbladder does not render you treifa. Which is interesting, by the way, because today, a lot of people live without a gallbladder. You just have to modify your diet, if I'm not mistaken, right? Or to some degree. But anyway.
But it's just a play on words, really. Mararuti means my bitterness.
Well,
it's not literal.
License.
I'm not sure if it's poetic license or they literally understand that the word mirei rasi is a reference to the gallbladder. The context of the pasuk is talking about his organs, because the first part of the pasuk talks about his kidneys, and that's why it makes sense to say mirei rasi is talking about his gallbladder.
What is it saying? Does the Mishnah specifically say gallbladder?
Yes, a mara is a gallbladder.
So how can they argue on the specific? How do the Chamim take it out? I mean that they discount it. The opinion that says that the gallbladder is not to be included, if it's written in the Mishnah.
Well, because the Mishnah goes according to one Tana. The Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. And what we're suggesting is the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. Okay.
Question. Animals, maybe it's more essential than in humans?
It could be. I don't know. That's why I'm not an expert in veterinary science. But so what the point the Gemara making is Vadayin Eov Kayim. Eov was alive to tell the tale. So that shows that it's not a vital organ. Amar lahem ein maskirin ma'isa nisim. So what was Rabbi Yossi's response to that argument? Eov is an exceptional case because he was sustained miraculously. He sustained injuries that normal people would not be able to survive. And miraculously, he was kept alive. And how do I know that? De'ilo teimahachi, because you have to say that, because take a look at the first part of the pasuk, Yifalach kil Yosai velo yachmol, that God will destroy or afflict my kidneys and without compassion. So Mika chaye, how can a person live without his kidneys? So clearly, Ella niso shiny. So you have to conclude that even though Eov had major organ failure, he still was miraculously sustained. Dichsiv rakis nafsho shmor hachanami niso shiny. And why is that? Because if you look at the beginning of the story of Eov, basically the Satan came to God and said, I'd like to test Eov to make sure that he's still faithful, even if he has to go through suffering. And God says, okay, but make sure you don't kill him. So, and the Gemara in Bava Basra says that the Satan's task was much more difficult than Eov's trials, because he had to afflict him and still manage to keep him alive. So what essentially the Gemara is pointing out is that if it weren't for the miraculous intervention of this angel, the Satan, Eov clearly would have died as a result of all of this organ trauma. Okay, Va'amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Rabbi Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha kedivrei ha'omer kezayis. The next thing that Rabbi Yitzchak bar Rabbi Yosef said in the name of his Rebbe Rabbi Yochanan is that as long as there's a statement that we're going to learn about more, is that, if the liver is missing, then as long as there's a kezayis left of liver, in other words, a lobe that's the size of a kezayis, the animal is not a treifa. So the Gemara says, Umi Amar Rabbi Yochanan hachi. How did Rabbi Yochanan say such a thing? Because V'ha'amar Rabba bar Barchana Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha kistam Mishnah. Another student of Rabbi Yochanan had said that Rabbi Yochanan always paskins like a Mishnah that does not list the authorship, which means that Rabbi Yochanan has to hold like our Mishnah. Utanan nitla hakavi v'lo nishtar hemena klum. Our Mishnah says that if the entire liver is removed and nothing remains, which implies that hanishtayer keshera aflagav delo havi kezayis. That implies, our Mishnah implies, that even if a tiny piece of liver is still left in the animal, smaller than a kezayis, the animal is still kosher. So you have a contradiction. On the one hand, you're quoting Rabbi Yochanan as saying that you need at least a kezayis of liver intact in order for the animal to be kosher, but our Mishnah implies that even a piece of liver that's smaller than a kazayas is kosher. So how do you reconcile it? Amoroi ninu v'aliba de Rabbi Yochanan. That it's a machlokes amoroim. 1 second, just allow me to finish for 1 second. So the Gemara answers that it's a machlokes amoroim. There are two different students of Rabbi Yochanan. One student of Rabbi Yochanan says that Rabbi Yochanan always follows the Stam Mishnah, and therefore, according to him, a piece of liver even smaller than a kazayas is kosher. And according to Rav Yitzchak, it's not always that Rabbi Yochanan paskins like a Stam Mishnah. At his discretion, he'll paskin like a Stam Mishnah, but sometimes will be an overriding concern, and sometimes he won't. Mr. Friedman.
No, I said, I heard an opinion, if you taste, there is the moro in the taste, it's still kosher, even if there is nothing left.
Nothing left of the mora. I don't
less
understand.
than the kazayas.
You're talking about the kaved?
Yeah.
So
When the taste is the bitterness, you can taste it, that is still a kosher.
So 1 second. You're talking about you shech the behema,
Yeah.
and you don't find the kaved. So
Don't find-
so what is it? What is it that you're tasting exactly?
The spot where the liver was, but
Interesting. Okay, maybe we'll see that in the Gemara
I
later.
know, but
Could be. Okay, I believe if you're quoting it, I'm sure it's there somewhere. So we'll just have to wait till we find it. That they changed the gears on the side, and the next is V'amar Reb Yitzchak b'Reb Yosef Amar Reb Yochanan Mara shenikva v'kavet sosmasa kishera. Now we learned before that Reb Yochanan paskins that if there's a puncture in the gallbladder, the animal's treifa. But here's an exception. What if there's a puncture in the gallbladder, but it's the part of the gallbladder that is flush pressing against the liver? In that situation, the gallbladder is kosher, the animal is still kosher, because the hole is being protected and covered by the liver. V'amar Reb Yitzchak b'Reb Yosef Amar Reb Yochanan nikev hakorkaban v'kish shelo kayim kosher. Another statement made by Reb Yitzchak in the name of his Rebbe, Reb Yochanan, is that if the gizzard of a bird has a puncture in it, so normally we say that the puncture renders the animal treifa. But that's only if the puncture is through and through. But there's a membrane called the kis that is on the inside of the gizzard. If that membrane is still intact, so then even though there's a puncture on the external tissue, the animal is still kosher. So now the question was raised, well, what if the inner membrane was punctured and the outer tissue is intact? What would be the halacha there by the korkaban? So Tashma, the Amar of Nachman, Nikev ze below ze, and then the Bach puts in the words Ozeh shelo keneged ze kasha. That Rav Nachman was quoted as saying is that if there's a puncture in only one of the two membranes, either the external or the internal, but not in both, it's still kosher. And the Bach's text is, even if there's a puncture in both the external and the internal, but they're not aligned with each other, because they're on two different parts of the gizzard, so then the animal is still kosher. And we're going to get back to that idea of unaligned punctures. Amar Rava, Shnei oros yesh lo leveshet, chitzon adam upnibi lavan. Nikev ze below ze kosher. So Rava makes a statement, and he says, number one, to describe the physiology of the esophagus, the veshet. The esophagus has two linings of tissue. There's the external tissue, and then there's the internal lining of the esophagus. The external tissue is red in color. The internal tissue is white in color. And as long as normally, if the esophagus is punctured, it renders the animal treifa. Remember, we said the kaneh, which is the windpipe, has to be severed more than 50% in order for it to be a treifa. But the esophagus is a much more delicate organ, and if only it sustains a puncture, it's going to be treifa. But that's if it's punctured through and through. If only the external membrane is punctured, but the internal is intact, or vice versa, the animal is still kosher. Now, lamali lameimar chitzon adamu pinimi lavan. So the question we ask Rava is, why did you make a point of describing the color of both the external and the internal membrane? So the first answer is the chalif treifa. is because if you ever do a post-mortem on an animal and you discover the outside of the esophagus is white and the inside is red, so you know this is a verkakta animal, and it's a treifa. In other words, there's something inside out about its organs, and it's a treifa animal. Ibayalahu, nikvu shnehem zeh shelo keneged zeh ma'u. So now the question is, okay, well, what's going to be the halacha if both the outer and the inner membrane of the esophagus are punctured, but they're not aligned? So the outer one is punctured over here on the south side, and the inner membrane is punctured on the north side. What's going to be the halacha there? So Amar Mar Zutra Mishmei Rav Papa, Beveshet Kasher Bekorkaban Pasel. So Mar Zutra, quoting Rav Papa, says that when it comes to the esophagus, it's kosher. But with the gizzard, if the gizzard has both the inner and the outer membranes punctured, even if they're not aligned, it's going to be treifa. So that's the difference. We're more lenient with the esophagus than we are by the gizzard. So maskif lo Ravashi adarabba, veshet da'achla bei upaya bei ravach gamdale upashtale zimnen demihandazin bahadi hadadi korkaban demeinach nayach kedekoi koi. The language is a little difficult, but it essentially means as follows. Logically, you should say just the opposite. You should be more machmir by the esophagus than you are by the gizzard. Why? For a very simple reason. The esophagus is a constantly moving organ. What do we mean by that? The animal is swallowing food. That causes the esophagus to contract and to expand. It's also near the vocal cords, and it's near the trachea. And so therefore there's constant airflow coming in and out. There's motion through the vocal cords. And so there's going to be a constant movement of the esophagus such that even misaligned holes have a good chance at some point of aligning with each other because of the constant motion. And therefore there's more of it, whereas the korkaban, the gizzard, is a stationary organ. It's not regularly moving. I mean, all of our organs move, but just very slightly. But the gizzard is not a moving organ. And therefore, if you have two misaligned punctures, there's no reason to assume that they're going to align themselves at any point. And therefore, you should be more lenient by the korkaban than you are by the veshet. That's the argument. So, Amar le Rav Acha berei Rav Yosef le Ravashi hachin amrinan mishmei de Mar Zutra damar mishmei de Rav Papa kavasach. So it's interesting. Rav Acha turns to Ravashi and he says, you know what? When we learned the statement of Mar Zutra quoting Rav Papa, we learned it like you. That actually Rav Papa had said exactly like you argued, based on logic, that we're more machmir by the veshet because of its tendency to be in motion, and therefore there's a greater chance of the two misaligned holes of aligning, whereas by the korkaban we're more lenient because there's no chance of the two misaligned holes to align with each other. Va'amar Rabba, krum sha'ola machmas maka beveshet eno krum. Here's another halacha that Rabbah said, and that is that, when an organ is injured, it tends to form a scab, some kind of exudate tissue, right? And that's true both with external organs and internal organs. If you have an esophagus that has sustained a puncture, and then you note doing the post-mortem that the puncture was covered over by some kind of scab, that still renders the animal a treifa. Don't think that because the hole sealed itself, it's kosher. The reason is because, or scar tissue, is because that scar tissue or scab is given to peel off very easily. Had that animal continued living, eventually that scab or tissue would have peeled off or separated from the hole, and the animal would have remained a treifa. And that's the reason why you can't use that seal as a means for rendering the animal kosher.
In contradistinction to the gallbladder that seals against the liver and
that's considered to be more permanent, yeah. Va'amar Rabba veshet ein lo bedika mi bachutz ela bifnim l'may nafkamina l'safek derusa. So then the next statement that Rabba makes is that when you do a post-mortem on the esophagus, you have to check it from the inside, and checking it from the outside is insufficient. Now, as we're going to see, you don't automatically have to check an animal's esophagus. You can assume that it's kosher. So under what conditions do we say that when you're required to check it, you have to check the inside, and checking the outside is insufficient? The answer is, if it's a suffix drusa. Now, we're going to learn this in about 10 blot or a dozen blot from now. The Gemara is going to talk about when you encounter scenarios where the scenario suggests that the animal may have been rendered treifa. There, after you shech the animal, you have to do a post-mortem on all of the vital organs. And the example that the Gemara gives is a suffix drusa, where you're not sure whether a feline attacked, you see a cat in the hen house. There's a machlokus between Rav and Shmuel, I believe, over there, that says, do you have to suspect that the animal was mauled? And when we say mauled, what we mean is that the animal, the feline, took its talons and inserted it into the chicken's body, and the chicken sustained some kind of toxin or poison from the talons of the cat. And that's this very serious issue, because it's not so much the puncture that causes the treifa, but rather the poison or toxin that's in the nails of the cat that injects, that causes the animal to become a treifa. So there may be very, very faint symptoms. Certainly externally you won't be able to tell, so you'll have to open up the animal and check. Now, what's one of the cases? It's the case of the esophagus. You have to check the esophagus after you shech the chicken. Post-mortem, you have to check it on the inside tissue and not on the outside. Why? What's the reason? The answer is because the way that you can tell that an animal has sustained this kind of poison is that its tissue turns red. So what did we say about the outside of the esophagus?
Red.
It's red tissue. You won't be able to tell. So you have to look on the inside of the esophagus where the tissue is normally white, and if you find redness, then you know that the animal has sustained poison. Yeah, Bill?
It's very likely, given what they knew those days, that the poison is bacteria. That
Correct.
would be the most likely
Absolutely
thing.
correct. Rav Eliyahu Dessler says that in an essay that I quote quite often. Now,
And just inflammation. The redness is just an inflammation response.
yeah, right, yeah. Now, he safek drusa da soy lekame deraba have a kabodik le rabba leveshet me'avroi. So the Gemara now tells us a story that one time this a chicken came before Rabbah, where they suspected that it had been mauled by a cat. And Rabbah started doing a post-mortem, is inspecting the esophagus, and is only looking at it on the outside. And he's doing this in front of his student Abaya. So Amar le Abaya v'hamarhu damar veshet ein lo bedika ela mibifnim. Afche Rabbah ubadke v'shtacha chalei tre korte dama v'tarfa. So Abaya sees what his Rebbe is doing. He says, Rebbe, you're the one who was the originated this halacha, that when you check the esophagus after a suspicious maul, then you have to check the inside, not just the outside. So Rabbah said, okay, good. So he turned it inside out, found 2 spots of blood on the white tissue, and declared it to be treif. So, v'Rabbah nami lechadude le'abayu hu deboy. And the Gemara points out and says, it's not that Rabbah forgot the halacha. He was deliberately farhering Abaya to see if Abaya would detect that what he was doing was insufficient. Of course I knew that you have to, I was testing you. Of course I knew that. I was testing you. I say that all the time. Amar Ula. Yeah, but the Gemara means it seriously. Amar Ula. Yashav lo kotz beveshet ein choshishin shema hivri. So Ula now says that if you find a thorn embedded in the inside of the esophagus, in the inside tissue of the esophagus, but it does not come through on the outside, you're allowed to declare the animal to be kosher. What's the fear? Maybe it was originally the thorn punctured through and through, and a scab formed on the outside. So the Gemara says you don't have to suspect that. You can be lenient and rely on the assumption that the thorn never made it through to the other side. And ula maishna misafik drusa. So the Gemara says, what gives Ula this sense of being so at liberty to be lenient and make that assumption? Why is that any different from when you have a suspicious situation where you suspect that a chicken was mauled? There you have to be machmir if you find any symptom of poison. So kesavar Ula ein choshishin l'safek drusa. So the answer is that it's a machlokus over there. And Ula, just like he's lenient here, he's lenient over there also, and says you don't have to suspect that an animal was mauled just because you find a cat in the hen house. Umayshna, Mishtei chatichos echa shel chela ve'echel shel shuman. This is a very yesodistic sugya, which means that it's a very important, like the Sefer Shav Shmaitza deals with this a lot, in sort of the concept of suffix, right? Here the Gemara challenges the whole premise of suffix. Why is it sometimes that we're lenient on cases of suffix, even suffix deoraisa, and why over here, and why in other cases are we machmir? So the Gemara says, why is ula makil over here, when in a case where you have two pieces of fat, you know that one is chelev, forbidden fat, and one is shuman, permitted fat. If you eat one of them, you have to bring a carbon to atone. Why? Why can't you just assume, like over here, that everything that you ate is okay, and the thing that's left is the forbidden fat? So hasam is chazek isura. Hacha lo is chazek isura. So the Gemara answers, because over there you knew for sure that in this system that you're dealing with, there is definitely isser, definitely something forbidden. In our case, we don't know that there was ever anything forbidden because we have no reason to jump to the conclusion that the thorn punctured through and through. Let me ask you another question. What about a case where you shecht an animal, and then after you shechted it, you check the knife and you discover that there's a nick in the knife, which would render the animal to be a nevela? So there we're machmir. Why would Ula agree to be machmir over there and be makel over here by the thorn? Hasam isyada le'reyes besakin. So the Gemara answers, because there too, currently we now find that we know that there's definitely a problem here, right? It's just a question of turning back the clock. Was this current problem a problem 5 minutes ago or not? Since we know that there's definitely a problem in our current system, that's why we're machmir. Here we don't see any problem because the hole does not go through to the outside, and that's why we can be lenient. Then the Gemara asks, why is this any different from a standard case of any time you encounter suffix tuma in a private domain, we say you have to be machmir. Like if you find a sheretz and you're not in a cellar and you're not sure if it touched certain foods, you have to be machmir and assume that it did. So the Gemara says, but on the flip side, you could ask the opposite question, which is that when it's in a public domain and there's a suffix tuma, we're lenient. So ella what? Ella hasam hilchasa gemiri lamisota. There, it's not based on logic. There, in the case of suffix tuma, it's based on a halacha l'Moshe misinai, which tells us to learn from the laws of sota. A sota that we don't know whether she was defiled or not. If it's in a private domain, we are machmir and assume that she was defiled. And if it's in a public domain, we assume she wasn't defiled. So therefore, that's where we extrapolate this from, not based on logic, but based on the way that the Torah describes that halacha. But when it comes to logical matters, if you have no isser currently in your system, there's no reason to assume that there was at some point previously an isser. Yosef hahume rabbanon kameder of kahana v'yosef v'ka'amar nimseis itmar avol yashav chayshina. So there was a certain sage who was sitting once in front of Rav Kahana, and he wanted to be machmir. And he said, no, the only time that that previous Amora had suggested that if you find this is Ula, right? Ula had said that if you find a thorn in the esophagus, then you can be makel and not assume that it punctured and that the puncture was covered by a scab. He says that's only true if it's a loose thorn in the esophagus. But if the thorn is embedded in the wall of the esophagus, even though it's not coming through and through, you have to assume that at some point it did come through and through and it was covered over by a scab. So Amr Lahu Rav Kahana lo tatzi sule yashav itmar abol nimseis lo itzterich leula dekulu chivoi briasa kotze achlan. And Rav Kahana said, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Don't listen to him. It's not true. Ula was makel even when the thorn was embedded in the inner tissue of the esophagus. He says, to tell me that if you find a loose thorn inside the esophagus that you could be makel, I don't need Ula to teach me that. Every animal of the wild ends up swallowing the occasional thorn. So obviously such an animal is kosher. You never have to worry about that. He was talking about when it's embedded in the wall of the esophagus. That's where you can be makel, and you don't have to fear that perhaps it went through and through and it was covered later. Itmar, turbat saveshet, Rav Omar b'mashahu, u'Shmuel Omar beruba. Here's a fascinating sugya. Now, turbat saveshet is translated in as the pharynx. What is the pharynx? The pharynx is the esophagus, which is the tube that goes to your stomach, begins in the throat, and it flares out because to conform to the morphology of the back of the mouth and the throat, right? And as it gets closer down towards the bottom of the throat, it tapers and it becomes just a regular tube. So the turbat haveshet is where the esophagus begins in the throat and it's flared. In other words, it's a wider part of the organ. Okay, and so the halacha is there's a machlokus here between Rav and Shmuel, and the machlokus is that Rav says b'mashahu. Rav says that it's no different from the rest of the esophagus, that if it's only just punctured, that's enough to render the animal a treifa. Ushmuel Omar beruvo, and Shmuel says no, it's a totally different organ. It's not the same as the esophagus. The esophagus, a small puncture renders a treifa, but the pharynx it has to be severed more than 50% in order for it to render the animal treifa, just like the trachea. Okay? So Rav Amar b'mashahu makom shchitahu, u'Shmuel Amar berubo lav makom shchitahu. Now listen to this basis. Rav says, I'm consistent, because since I hold that it's part and parcel of the entire structure of the esophagus, it has the same halacha as the esophagus. And therefore, connected to that is that since it's a part of the esophagus, if the shaychet would place the knife a little bit too high on the throat, such that he's cutting through the pharynx instead of cutting through the esophagus, well, since it's part of the esophagus, it's a kosher shechita. And Shmuel says, no, it's a totally different organ. And therefore, if the shaychet were to cut through the pharynx instead of cutting through the esophagus, he would render the animal a treifa as if he cut through more than half of it. Okay, so that's interesting. And so, hey nihu turbat savesha. So the Gemara's question now is, what is the pharynx? In other words, how much of the beginning of the esophagus is qualified as this organ? Amar Mori bar Mar Ukva, Amar Shmuel, Kol Shechoscho Umarchiv Zehu Turbitz, Haveshet, Choscho Ve'omer B'Mekomo Zehu Veshet Atzmo. So Mori bar Mar Ukva says that the way to determine it is when you take the organ and you cut through it on its width, the turbat saveshet, the pharynx, as soon as you cut it into, the musculature of that part of the esophagus causes the tissue to immediately separate once you cut it. Whereas the esophagus proper, if you cut it, there's nothing in the musculature of that organ to cause the tissue to separate when you sever it along its width. So that's one way of understanding it. However, Amar lahu Rav Papi, Mar lo Amar Hachi, Umanu Rav Bibi bar Abaya. So he says, my Rebbe didn't learn it that way. My Rebbe Rav Bibi bar Abaya said as follows: Ela kol shechoscho v'omi b'mekamo zehu turbat saveshet, ela ezehu veshet atzmo kol shechoscho v'chavitz. He says, my Rebbe said that when you cut the pharynx, it doesn't expand at all. It just stays in its place. When you sever the esophagus proper, not only does it not stay in its place and expand, but rather it contracts. And that's a sign that you can tell the difference between the esophagus and the pharynx, or what's called the turbit savesha. So Yona, Omar Reb Zera, Mival Asa. So the sage named Yona, and it's not clear, according to maybe Rebbe Yona is the way they have the girsa, said in the name of Reb Zera that it's the area of where the animal swallows. That's how you describe the pharynx. Now, Vikama, and how wide is that portion of the esophagus to be called the pharynx and have that unique status? Amar Rav Ivya pachos misa'arata va'adif mechitasa. So Rav Ivya is a minimalist, and he says it's a very small margin. It's a very small width. It's a little bit larger than a wheat kernel, but smaller than a barley kernel in width. So it's a very, very small ribbon of tissue that's at the very beginning of the esophagus where this issue becomes a machlokes. Now, it's not clear whether he's arguing with the other Amoraim or not, because it seems like, since he's saying that it's only the area where you swallow, that's different from what was previously suggested, that it depends on, if you cut it, does it expand, does it not expand? It could be that this issue is disputed, as far as the width of what's called the pharynx.
Is this a cow? We're still talking about cow.
We're talking about any animal.
Even a bird.
Well, it's not clear that we're talking about a bird, but certainly we're talking about mammals. We're talking about goats, sheep, cows.
Tongue would be very adjacent to it, I guess.
I don't know. You'll have to take a look at your anatomy books. Hahu Torah dahava livnei Rav Ukva diischel beishchita beturbetz haveshet v'gomar beveshet. So now let's look at an interesting story. There was a shoichet who took the animal of the children of Mar Ukva, or Rav Ukva, and he did a shchita that was a bit questionable, because the knife was a little bit too high on the neck. So he started cutting on a bias. He started cutting through the pharynx and then cut downwards until it cut through the esophagus proper. So he really only nicked the pharynx and then cut into the esophagus proper. So the question is, what's the status of the shchita? Is it a good shchita? Is it a bad shchita? So Amar Rava Ramina le chumri de Rav chumri de Shmuel v'tarifna le. So Rava says we're going to be machmir by throwing at this animal the chumras of Rav and the chumras of Shmuel to render this animal a treifa. Let's explain. Chumrei de Rav de Amar Rav b'mashu. That Rav says that if the pharynx is punctured even a small amount or nicked, it renders the animal a treifa. So therefore, since granted it was only a nick of the pharynx, but nonetheless that was enough to render the animal a treifa. But wait a minute, v'hama Rav makom shchitahu. But didn't Rav also say that the pharynx is a part and parcel of the esophagus, and therefore it's legal to shecht the animal there? So what's the big deal if you nicked the pharynx? You just did a kosher shchita. So the Gemara answers, Kishmuel damar lav makom shchita. So that's where he's being machmir, like Shmuel, who says that it's not the correct place of shchita because it's a separate organ from the esophagus. Now, Ishmuel ha'amar berubo. But 1 second, if you're going to go like Shmuel, who says that it's a separate organ, then you should also say that you need to sever it more than halfway in order for it to be treifa, and you've only nicked it. So what are you doing? So kirav de amar b'mashu. So that's why we're being machmer like Rav, who says that if it's even nicked a slight amount, that renders the animal treifa. But what's going on here is that it's a contradictory psak. Because basically the only way to accomplish it as a treifa is if you say that it's not a kosher shchita, because it's not considered the esophagus, but you're giving it the chumras of the esophagus by saying even a small puncture renders it a treifa. So it's self-contradictory in that respect. Are you following us, right? He's basically taking one from column A, a chumra from column A, and a chumra from column B to render the animal a treifa, which is problematic. So the Gemara now says, Yigalgel milsa matoi lekami de Rebbe Abba. So through a series of events, this question came to Rebbe Abba. They told him what Rava had paskined. And Amrluhu Torah bein l'Rav bein l'Shmuel Shari. Zilu Amrule l'Brei de Rav Yosef bar Chama de Lishlam de Meitura l'Mare. So Rebbe Abba was indignant. He says, what's going on over here? He says, the animal, Niman Avshach, is kosher, whether you paskin like Rav, it's kosher, because you did a kosher shchita, because the pharynx is a part of the esophagus. And if you're going to hold like Shmuel that it's not part of the place of shchita, so all you did was nick it, so you didn't render the animal a treif, and eventually you cut through the right place, which is the esophagus. So either way it's kosher. So therefore you, Rava, tell Rava, and they used a euphemistic name, the son of Rav Yosef, they didn't want to address him by name, he's got to pay the sons of Rav Ukva the cost of the loss of their animal by declaring it treifa. So Amar Mar Berei de Ravina Mosvina Tiyuvta Klapi Sanoi de Rava. So Mar Berei de Ravina says, I presented the following brisa as a challenge to the enemy of Rava. Again, speaking euphemistically, he's presenting it as a challenge to Rava, but he doesn't want to say that he challenged Rava directly, so he said to the enemy of Rava. It's a lashon sagi nahor, right? La'olam hilchasa. What does the brisa say? La'olam hilchasa kedivrei beis Hillel v'harot salasus kedivrei beis Shammai ose kedivrei beis Hillel oise. The brisa starts off by saying that we paskin like Beis Hillel, but If a person wishes to go like Beis Shammai, he can. And if he wishes to go like Beis Hillel, he can, which seems to be a contradiction. If you just said we paskin, we'll get to that in a second. Now, but then the Brisa says, Mikule Beis Shammai, Mikule Beis Hillel Rasha. The important thing is you have to be consistent. Either go like Beis Hillel all the time, or go like Beis Shammai all the time. If you paskin like the kulas of Beis Hillel and the kulas of Beis Shammai, then you're an evil person, because you're always looking for the easy way out. Mechumrei Beis Shammai, Mechumrei Beis Hillel, Olav HaKosav Omer Haksil B'Choshech Cholech. But if you always paskin l'chumra, I know some people like that, they go like the chumras of Beis Shammai and they go like the chumras of Beis Hillel, you're not a Rasha, you're an idiot, right? Because as it says in Koheles, an idiot walks in darkness, right? A fool walks in darkness. So how can you, basically the question is, right? So the Brisa concludes, it says, Ela ika beis Shammai kekuleinu chuchumreya, and ika beis Hillel kekuleinu chuchumreya. You have to be consistent. Either follow all of Beis Shammai's psak, or follow all of Beis Hillel's psak, both whether it's stringent or lenient. So the Gemara, so that's the challenge to Rava. We're not going to answer the challenge today, but first we got to analyze the Brisa. Hagufa kasha amart laolam halacha kedivrei Beis Hillel v'hadur tani v'harot salasus kedivrei Beis Shammai yaseh. I don't understand. You started off by telling me we paskin like Beis Hillel, and then you said, but if you want, you could go consistently like Beis Shammai. How can that be? So the Gemara says, Lo kasha kan koidem baskol kan la'achar baskol. So one answer is, because the Gemara says that there were, at one point in the debates between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, a heavenly voice rang forth and said, we paskin like Beis Hillel. So if you live after the baskol, the heavenly voice, so you have to paskin like Beis Hillel. If you lived, however, before the baskol, you could choose to paskin either consistently like Beis Shammai or consistently like Beis Hillel. I'll give you another answer. Even if you live after the baskol, there's a machlokas tanoim between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua whether you're obligated to listen to a heavenly voice. Some rabbis say you do, and Rabbi Yoshua says you don't have to. So that's why, even though baskol said that we paskin consistently like Beis Hillel, if you want to consistently go like Beis Shammai, you have the right to do so. We're still faced with the question, how could Rava paskin l'chumra like both Rav and Shmuel to trafe up the animal? We'll hold it here for today.
Say Rabbi Yeshua.